is Guyduplessis, and I apologize if I mispronounce that. A little bit about him. He is a researcher and instructor at the iSystem Institute for Transdisciplinary Studies at Utah State University. Also an adjunct professor at the Institute for Advanced Psychotherapy at Loyola University, Chicago, and is the director of the South African Logic-Based Therapy and Consulting Institute. He is the author and co-author of 6 books, including Building Recovery Resilience, published by Cambridge University Press, and a contributor to several edited volumes. Today, he will be speaking on philosophy as a way of life and logic-based therapy. Thank you so much, and whenever you're ready.
Thank you for the introduction, and a great pleasure to be here. Thank you. Is my audio good? Is it... Okay. Yeah. I'm just going to share my screen, the PowerPoint. Yeah, it's this one. Sorry, it's just this setting here that's not on. Let me just put that on. Oh no, it's asking me to shut down Zoom to do that setting. Well, I'll just do it. I'll just do it without the PowerPoint then. Let me just see if there's another way.
I think it's working.
Oh, that seems to work. Okay, great. Okay. Okay, is it sharing properly now?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, great pleasure to be here. Today my talk is going to be about philosophy as a way of life and logic-based therapy, and the relationship between the two. And it's something that I haven't heard much about. So this is sort of just an introductory to that topic on that relationship. So the presentation explores the relationship between the French philosopher Pierre Daul's meta-philosophical concept of philosophy as a way of life, which has gained quite a lot of traction in the last 10 years or so as a field within philosophy and logic-based therapy. It's got 3 parts. The first part just explores the concept of philosophy as a way of life. And the second part explores the notion of philosophy being a distinct form of therapy as a thread that runs through ancient, classical, and modern philosophy, which is the idea that philosophy as a way of life is also based on. And the final part explores the relationship between the concept of philosophy as a way of life and LBT, highlighting some similarities and also some differences. Some of what I will conclude is that in my opinion, LBT represents a theory and practice that is congruent with Daul's conceptualization of philosophy as a way of life, yet presents what could be called a more sophisticated and also a more all-encompassing metapsychological framework. So in simple terms, it's a broader lens, it's a broader application of the type of sort of meta therapeutic and meta-psychological framework. And then I would say LBT is unique within the therapeutic philosophical tradition, spanning from antiquity until now, due to the core idea of client resonance, which I think is quite unique to LBT in the context of philosophy as a way of life, because all the other schools had a particular dogma that you followed or not. So there's something unique there. It's the quote from Epicurus that sort of sums up the Hellenistic idea of philosophy as a way of life. Empty are the words of a philosopher who offers therapy for no human suffering. For just as there is no medical expertise if it does not give therapy for bodily disease, so too there's no use in philosophy if it does not expel the suffering of the soul. And that could be sort of a short description of the way Hellenistic philosophers view the purpose of philosophy. So just to focus on Hadot's conception of philosophy as a way of life. For Hadot and for those that study philosophy as a way of life, to see that in the ancient world, philosophy transcended mere academic study, embodying a mode of existence that aimed to transform the whole of the practitioner's life. It was not a discipline as it is now, or only now, but also a way of life. Pierre Hadot coined the term philosophy as a way of life based on his hermeneutic reading of ancient philosophical texts to emphasize the performative potential of philosophy and the role it could ideally play in transforming rather than merely theorizing about life. And in his study of ancient texts, he notes that the Hellenistic philosophers like the Epicureans, skeptics, and Stoics viewed philosophy as art of living, and essentially viewing it in its fullest sense as transformational. So the concept of philosophy as a way of life is not just a particular way of studying philosophy, but it's also a metaphilosophical concept to study philosophy, but also apply the therapeutic strand of philosophy within philosophy itself. So it's a sort of a lens that's got a couple of functions. Essentially, within this philosophical way of life is its therapeutic agenda. Hadot notes that ancient philosophy present, and I quote, itself as therapeutic, intended to cure mankind's anguish. And then there's also been several scholars that worked since Hadot has worked on similar concepts, particularly Martha Nussbaum and Michel Foucault, as most of you would be aware of. The therapeutic agenda of these ancient schools align with the aim of modern psychotherapy, and the philosophical counseling, sort of in retrospect, and philosophy clearly predates psychotherapy as a way of addressing some of the most disturbing and painful problems of human life. The idea of philosophy as therapeutic is obviously not a new idea for most philosophers, as Wittgenstein proposed the role of philosophy as akin to providing therapy for itself. But the notion of philosophy as a way of life is different from the Wittgensteinian model. Before Wittgenstein, a series of philosophers viewed philosophy as a form of psychological therapy, not therapy for the activity of philosophy itself, as Wittgenstein proposed, but rather as a means to address mental disturbances. There are several scholars that highlight, using the lens of philosophy as a way of life, that the notion of philosophy as therapeutic runs through from Socrates through the Hellenistic philosophers, medieval, Renaissance, Enlightenment philosophers, and through more modern philosophers like Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, Foucault, and then, of course, Hadot. And using the lens of philosophy as a way of life provides a new perspective on the history of philosophy, revealing hidden continuities between ancient, medieval, and modern philosophical thought that's often overlooked. So central to the notion of philosophy as a way of life, or Hadot's conception of it, is his notion of spiritual exercises. Hadot argued that many sections of the ancient texts, like the Enneads or Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, may seem puzzling when approached with contemporary metaphilosophical assumptions that prioritize argumentation or knowledge acquisition. Yet Hadot suggests that these texts become comprehensible when understood as incorporating what he terms spiritual exercises. These exercises defined by Doe and later elaborated by Michel Foucault, which he called technologies of self, involved various cognitive, mnemonic, imaginative, rhetorical, and physical activities selected by an individual for bringing about transformative change. And that was done within the philosophical framework of the particular school that they studied in. So clearly these sort of toolbox that these ancient philosophers use resembles very much what we do in modern psychotherapy and also philosophical counseling, although the techniques are, of course, different. I'm not going to go into this too much, but a central concept within this therapeutic agenda, sort of paradigmatically represented by the Hellenistic philosophers and the spiritual exercises, is the notion of return to the self. This needs to be sort of understood within the worldview that a lot of these philosophical schools propose. For instance, the Stoics that believed in a sort of ordered cosmos, etc. I'll just quote directly here from Ado. All spiritual exercises are fundamentally a return to the self, in which the self is liberated from a state of alienation into which it has been plunged by worries, passions, and desires. The self liberated in this way is no longer merely our egoistic, passionate individuality. It is our moral person, open to universality, objectivity, and participating in the universal nature of thought. For a metaphor that Dada often used to try and explain the essence of spiritual exercises was borrowed from Plotinus, who compared this inward reflection to the work of a sculptor, sculpting away at a block of marble to reveal the hidden statue within. Dada argues that Plotinus believed the sculptor merely reveals what already exists in the marble. Similarly, Joseph Sen notes in the ancient ethics that Plotinus viewed the inner self as a process of subtraction. The ideal psychic state is not something to be newly made or created, but is experienced with the removal of those accretions which have hidden and thus prevented the realization of the self, which we already are. And it's for this reason that Ado was critical of Foucault's technologies of the self, which he critiqued as a sort of self-improvement techniques that's merely focused on the self, as sort of nearly a type of dandyism, as he sometimes called it. So this is also some, I would say, some element of critique of elements of psychology that is particularly focused on just self-improvement. And Ado noted that for the Hellenistic philosophers, it wasn't a notion of self-improvement, it was a notion of liberating, a return to the self, which in more simple terms can be understood as a more interconnected self with a natural world, society, and the greater whole, not necessarily referring to collectivism, but it also reminds me of Nietzsche's statement of become who you are. Nietzsche was, of course, influenced by Heraclitean metaphysics, which viewed the self as very much interconnected. So I'm going to briefly touch upon philosophy as a way of life and psychotherapy to highlight the relationship there eventually with logic-based therapy. So the notion of philosophy as a way of life, not as a term in psychology, but the notion of psychology drawing on Hellenistic philosophers and philosophy began to emerge at the turn of the century. That was before Ellis, when a Swiss psychiatrist, Paul Dubois, employed Socratic questioning with his patients and taught them the basics of Socratic and Stoic philosophy as a way of life. Indeed, he declared, if we eliminate from the ancient writings a few illusions that gave them local color, we shouldn't find the ideas of Socrates, Epictetus, Seneca, and Marcus Aurelius absolutely modern and applicable to our time. that was the sort of beginning of a rational approach to psychotherapy. And that was eventually eclipsed by psychoanalysis. And then from the 50s on, Stoicism was again brought to the fore, obviously by Albert Ellis, which most of you would be aware of, being familiar with LBT. Ellis actually wasn't aware of the work of Paul Du Bois, but said virtually exactly the same thing. And obviously, Ellis is well known to explain that the central premise of his emerging cognitive approach to psychotherapy, that emotional disturbances, etc., are not caused by external events, but mainly by our irrational belief about such events. And he also highlighted that that was far from being a new idea. And then he mentioned the several Stoic philosophers that influenced some of his thinking. So one can sort of, in that way, say, using the lens of philosophy as a way of life, that with Du Bois and Ellis and eventually Beck and eventually LBT coming out of that, that's the notion of philosophy as a way of life, as particularly our dose definition, and this therapeutic agenda philosophy being revived again in the modern age in psychotherapy. Yet also trying to revive the notion of philosophy as a way of life, particularly the spiritual exercises, obviously faces a significant obstacle for us today, because unlike the Stoics and the Platonists who saw the universe as a fuse with reason and something to imitate, that's why, for example, the Stoics would practice amor fati. Now, amor fati, accepting your fate entirely like that, maybe does not make that much sense if you don't believe that there's order in the universe, or you want to imitate the universe, sort of what's below, what's above, down, below. So just transposing those practices in the modern age without the metaphysical worldview that accompanies that certainly shouldn't just be done sort of doggedly. One needs to consider if it still makes sense within a different metaphysical worldview. So in many ways, and just to end that previous sentence, I think part of the problem now, not the problem, is obviously most people view as the universe lacking order, that it somehow sort of become disenchanted. And one could say in that way that contemporary psychotherapy, in many ways, is an attempt to deal with this disenchantment. And the techniques of modern psychotherapy are now spiritual exercises. But Ardot argued, and I would agree with Ardot, that there's something lacking in modern psychotherapy to adequately address the human condition and relieve suffering. I wouldn't say that there's just something lacking. I think there's a huge deal lacking. It can address psychopathology, but it can't necessarily address sort of general existential issues. So in the next section, I will discuss how LBT, as part of an interdisciplinary approach, may assist in addressing issues that psychotherapy often cannot adequately address. Just before I mention that, I just want to highlight that one needs to make a distinction between, well, I think one needs to make a distinction between philosophy that informs psychotherapy and the notion of philosophy as therapy. And some people that have explored the notion of philosophy as a way of life, psychotherapy sort of, once it works from this assumption that as soon as there's philosophically inspired psychotherapy, it could be understood as a philosophy as a way of life. But I see that as two very distinct things. The influence of philosophy on psychotherapy and psychology is substantive. And I would say there's current forms of psychotherapy that has got elements of the notion of philosophy as a way of life, or that is explicitly philosophical. For instance, REBT, Viktor Frankl's logotherapy, Mildred Boss's designs analysis, Otto Rank's will therapy, inspired by Nietzsche. But none of these, or many that I'm aware of, actually promotes the notion of a way of being for clients that is aligned with philosophy's way of life principles, rather than merely informing the therapeutic techniques. So even though LBT was informed by Stoicism, it doesn't mean that those that get taught RBT are now practicing a philosophy as a way of life or following Stoic principles. And the same with a lot of those other psychotherapies. So I would suggest that LBT is actually one of the few philosophical psychotherapeutics that promotes a way of being for clients that are, in my mind at least, aligned with those concept of philosophy as a way of life principles as paradigmatically represented by the Hellenistic schools. And I would say it's not one of the few, but I think one of the first that really brings the philosophy as a way of life aspect to the fore within the therapeutic practice, because it's not about what influences the psychotherapist, is more what the psychotherapist gives to the client. And personally, I see LBT, those that practice LBT, the clients, not the professionals, as a way of life, because otherwise it's not really going to be effective. So obviously, as most know, bringing in the last three steps of LBT is what makes it explicitly philosophical. And here, if one just looks at even just the name of these three steps, one can see how this would align with Pierre Dault's concept of philosophy as a way of life, because it is these three steps highlight a way of being in the world, not just something you do in psychotherapy for our week and then resolve a couple of issues and move on. I think it promotes a way of being in the world.
And Guy, I just want to just be mindful of time. You have about 5 minutes left.
Okay.
That's
All right. I'll be quick in the last ones. So just two things that I want to touch on briefly that I think is very unique with LBT as sort of a part of an interdisciplinary approach is the notion that it doesn't just address maladaptive beliefs, it actually puts something, in simple terms, put something in place of the maladaptive beliefs. I'll just read the last section here. Psychotherapies that address self-deception, accuracy, or flawed logic may require an intervention that would mitigate fragmentation anxiety. Because if maladaptive beliefs are corrected or confronted, a natural response for all of us is to experience fragmentation anxiety, and that creates a lot of obvious resistance. So LBT, with the guiding virtues and uplifting philosophies, gives, in simple terms, it puts something in place. By giving up these irrational worldviews, there's something else to put in its place. It doesn't just leave the person with anxiety. And then something I touched on briefly earlier, LBT as a meta-therapeutic framework as part of an interdisciplinary approach may assist in addressing existential issues such as what constitutes the good life. And one of the problems with psychology is that psychology doesn't really provide a worldview, as Freud noted, as a specialized branch of psychology, depth psychology, psychology of the unconscious. It is quite unsuited to form a Weltanschauung of the worldview. It must accept that of science in general. Now, of course, science is not necessarily a tool to provide a worldview. So LBT and psychotherapy both possess the potential to engender meaning in life by unearthing repressed opportunities. Nevertheless, philosophy, with its millennia-old tradition of contemplating existential inquiries, may have an advantageous position. So LBT alongside psychotherapy, but LBT can certainly provide the gaps that psychotherapy can't provide. So just in conclusion and in short, LBT represents a theory and practice that is congruent, I would say congruent with Hadot's conceptualization of philosophy as a way of life, but represents a broader metapsychological framework. It's unique in the therapeutic tradition due to the idea of client resonance, and LBT provides intervention that can address self-deception, accretion, full logic in a way that may mitigate fragmentation anxiety. And finally, LBT as a metatherapeutic framework as part of an interdisciplinary approach may assist in addressing existential issues, such as what constitutes the good life. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. There was so much great content in there. Thank you. And now we will open it to Q&A. If you have a question, just please unmute your mic.
I very much appreciated the lucidity of that presentation and the way you just keyed in to the essential features that distinguish LBT from other forms of therapy. And I think one of the things that you point out about the resonance is very important, and the way you put it made it even clearer to me how important it was. Oftentimes, I emphasize that you shouldn't force feed philosophies because it doesn't work with clients. It doesn't, But I think what you put it in a broader context, and it suggests that many of the other approaches do just that. Sure. If you were a Stoic, and that's all you were, was a Stoic, and you taught Stoic philosophy, and you decided that you were going to be a psychotherapist and do Stoic philosophy, then you'd lock the client into Stoic philosophy because, as you said, it's the client that practices it. It's not the therapist. So the therapist is a facilitator, really. It isn't up to them to espouse their own philosophy. And so, I'm aware too that logotherapy, for instance, has a program. Frankel Institute has a program of philosophical counseling, and they're marketing it as philosophical counseling, but it's logotherapy. And so all their clients get logotherapy. But what about the clients that don't resonate with existential approaches and they're more pragmatic, or they're more theistic, or what do? They get taught logotherapy and maybe it doesn't work. So I think it's really important what you're emphasizing there, because typically when I'm asked, what distinguishes LBT from other forms of cognitive behavior, at least, I said, well, it's the philosophical step, the three last steps that you point out. But I don't mention the resonance. So from now on, that's exactly what I'm going to do. So thank you so much for that.
Yeah, if I can respond to it, thanks, Elliot. Yeah, I think I mean, there might be other stuff that I'm not aware of, but as far as I know, LBT is the only philosophical therapeutics within this whole long tradition spanning back to Socrates and even pre-Socrates that works with the idea of client resonance. I can't think of another one that's comprehensive, not just relativist and sort of grab bag type, but actually a comprehensively developed approach that is internally consistent and logically coherent in and of itself, but promotes the idea of client resonance. I think it's the first time within this whole tradition that something like this has been developed, as far as I'm concerned. I think it's quite a big deal. You know?
Yeah. And one of the things that I know that your work involves is working with addicted populations, and you have often indicated to me that the philosophical aspects, the guiding virtues, for instance, sort of have a replacement value for the higher power concept in the 12-step program. I'm wondering if you could say some more about that aspect of it too, and what your experiences are there.
Sure. Yeah, I think with addicts, what I was sort of highlighting earlier about the fragmentation anxiety, replacing sort of maladaptive self-object organizations that's based on flawed logic is not something one just, you know, so let's say somebody in addiction say, okay, well, let's quickly change your entire worldview. You know, all your thinking is irrational. Let's negate that, and then tomorrow you have to be clean and live a happy life. Why it's so difficult for addicts to recover is that their worldview has been so infiltrated by the addiction that it's not something that can merely be replaced by giving somebody the right answer, because self-object experiences go deeper than just the logic. It goes, you know, nearly into like a cellular level. So, and for anybody giving up what structures their experience and sense of self is a terrifying experience, regardless of how dysfunctional it is. So within the 12 steps, the notion of high power and spiritual principles, etc. And for me, simply the psychodynamic function of that is that it provides somebody a sort of arena to form new self-object experience or new experiences relating to the world, self, and others that is adaptive. And for me, LBT is very much aligned with that, and that's what appealed to me LBT initially, is that it does that. I think just replacing flawed logic, I think is sometimes the instances can be more detrimental than positive, because one doesn't know what psychological function that flawed logic actually plays in somebody. Might play adaptive function, might be irrational, insane, but might be adaptive. So I think that's the great thing about LBT, is that the practice of the virtues and uplifting philosophies provides a playfield or an arena to form a new relationship to the world, oneself, and others that is based on, you know, fairly well-founded principles. These virtues on, you know, Billy didn't just suck it out of his thumb quickly. These things have been around for a long time. They stood the test of time. There's a reason they still exist. Yeah, so simply, yeah, in short.
Yeah, thanks. And I've been, you know, my recent work here has been with exploring the concept of interconnectivity with in LBT and the different modalities of interconnectivity that it has. And I'm just thinking here about, you know, what you're saying about the higher power concept and, you know, the use of the guiding virtues here. I'm wondering if it's the idea of interconnectivity, you know, in the 12-step program, connecting, you know, with self, others, and the world, you know, that makes the higher power construct, you know, effective within that framework, and whether the powers of interconnectivity of the guiding virtues pulls that together in a perhaps more articulated way than the 12-step higher power concept. What do you think?
I think it would appeal to certain people more, trying to understand what the sort of high power thing means within the 12 steps. You know, if you take all the floral language away, what's the actual psychological function? I think it's the last portion of that addicted population that would find the way that LBT articulates it more appealing than, let's say, the sort of quite archaic language of the 12 steps that was written, in the 30s and written right at the beginning of the program, because it doesn't quite mean what it says. It says this, but it actually means, as a counselor, you also have to tell people, I know it says this, but it actually means that. So I think LBT provides a language there and a methodology that would appeal to many people in that population, because I think they'd immediately see the connection between the function between the two, especially considering that REBT is often used there, and LBT provides the philosophical component. And my view is that addiction recovery is very much a philosophical therapeutic process. No, it's not a psychological process. It's very much a philosophical process. And I'd go as far as to say addiction is a philosophical problem that needs a philosophical cure, which might sound absurd, but AA says addiction is a spiritual problem, needs a spiritual cure. Now, I've never quite understood what the word spiritual quite means. They say it's not religious, but it's not that. I think it actually means philosophical. So I think LBT has the opportunity to bring a sophisticated philosophical approach to that world that is very much in need of that, because that's sort of the premise of the 12 steps is a spiritual program. And I mean, spiritual, if it's not religious, then really you're saying it's philosophical.
Thank you for that. Mm-hmm.
Thanks. Feedback.
I have a question about what you just mentioned, that addiction is not a psychological problem, but more of a philosophical problem. I've never heard that before, and it sounds, but it resonates with me. Can you say a little bit more about how it's more of a philosophical, I guess it can have more of a philosophical answer than a psychological one?
Yeah. Well, I would go sort of back to the to the history of AA, and a large part of the history of AA, because psychiatrists couldn't get alcoholics clean, nor could religion, because you had a lot of priests that were alcoholics. So and they go to psychiatrists, psychologists, and it just didn't work. And then there was a very rich guy called LBT that flew to Switzerland to go and see Jung, because he thought, I'm going to see the best guy in the world. And he flew to Jung, saw Carl Jung, and Jung said to him, sorry, I've worked with many alcoholics. I just can't help you guys. There's no hope for you. Yet I've seen people get better when they had what he called a spiritual awakening, and he used the phrase spiritum contra spiritus, spirit in contra of the spirit of alcohol. And that sort of statement played a big role in Bill W.'s development of the 12 steps, because Bill W. was a big fan of William James, and he read the varieties of religious experience and adopted his pragmatism. So that notion of spiritum contra spiritus, and then William James's pragmatism, or higher power of your choosing, gave this practical approach to spiritual transformation that wasn't dogmatic. So I don't think it's a big jump to say, well, spiritum contra spiritus. And I've always said, I've always found the word spiritual odd, because what does it mean? And people say it's not religious, but not spiritual. So, well, it's not. If it's not religion, then it's, then it's not religion. It's not psychology. If it's not religion or psychology, what else could it be? It's going to be philosophy. There's no other sort of options. So I think, simply put, you can translate Jung's words as sort of a philosophical issue that's in need of a philosophical cure. And fundamentally, that's what the 12 steps is. It's a philosophical way of life. It's not religious. It's not psychological. It's following principles, virtues, and applying it in daily affairs that's aligned with the higher power of your own understanding, the pragmatism, which is a overarching worldview. So I think it's philosophical sort of to the core. People just don't frame it that way often. Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing. That is very enlightful.
Thank you.
We have a couple more minutes if there are any other questions. I would like to ask you another question, just to
Sure.
follow up. During your presentation, correct me if I'm wrong, but I heard you say something about positive psychology, kind of how it's not as powerful as the logic, as using reasoning, to, I guess, combat um, let's say negative traits. And I know that a lot of positive psychology also kind of is tied to like pragmatism and the transcendentalists and William James. And I wonder how you see, I guess, character traits in connection to LBT, and if there can be any connection to strengthen maybe both, because I see positive psychology as also being a lot of philosophy, but they're just not framing it that way.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, from what I know about positive psychology, the whole thing is sort of founded on the practice of virtues that leads to character strengths. Um, but I think the difference between let's say LBT and and positive psychology is that positive psychology is also got a grab bag of, well, let's just choose this from there, and what is the guiding framework that there's a lot to choose from, from the past, like where do you choose from, and which virtues do you choose. um, um, but I don't think it's got that in the same way that LBT has got an uplifting philosophical framework that supports the guiding virtue, which I think is a big deal, because all virtues, it can only make sense within a metaphysical view, or a framework, because otherwise, and I think positive psychology doesn't really provide that. It just goes back to some elements of Aristotelian virtue, which obviously there's nothing wrong with that. Um, but I think what's lacking there is the is the uplifting framework, and also what's, like Elliot said earlier, what's congenial for the person. I mean, I like the idea of character strengths, that the virtues sort of build character strengths. Um, but I don't think it's as internally coherent, the whole theory, as logic-based therapy. It seems quite eclectic, which is also fine, but yeah, it's not a really coherent philosophical system that they present.
Recently, I published a paper in the journal Religions, and it's called Interconnectivity of Logic-Based Therapy. And it gets into some of the questions as far as how do you distinguish positive psychology from logic-based therapy. And one of the things that I point out there is pretty much what Guy is saying. In logic-based therapy, there are matching guiding virtues for the irrational thinking. And a lot of positive psychology, at least the way Martin Seligman framed it in his early work in his book, um, is that it's really for, if you're already, you want, the analogy that's used is a coach, a life coach, and you want to make your life better. And so let's concentrate on the virtues. But there's a failure to realize that when people come to psychotherapy, they're not looking for a life coach, like a health coach, like a bodybuilder coach or whatever. they're looking for somebody to help them out of crises, emotional problems that are preventing them from being happy. And they're into the negative numbers. They're not already into the positive numbers on a scale of security. And so they don't really address the idea of how you connect the irrational thinking with the virtues. It's sort of, let's concentrate on the virtues, let somebody else deal with the irrational thinking. So they give you half the story, and that half the story is oftentimes excluding the people that really need, psychotherapy the most. I know there was some later attempts, somewhat, not well developed attempts to try to connect them, but they still didn't have that idea of matching irrational thinking with, an uplifting philosophy and guiding virtues. And so I think, as Guy is pointing out, I think that's an important feature that positive psychology lacks.
Thank you so much for this, all this information. I love it. Thank you.
Sure. So pleasure to be here and present the talk. Thank you.
And I think that concludes this lively Q&A.